welcome to the stage Pierre Stecco from Trinity Consultants, who is a sponsor of this next keynote portion of today's program. So please join me in welcoming Pierre.
Okay, thanks, Jonas. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pierre Stecco. I'm an aquatic scientist and managing principal with Trinity Consultants, which includes minnow-environmental, ecofish research, and ecological logistics and research, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot is a senior fellow and the director of energy, natural resources, and environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. She also serves as a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada and a research advisor to the Indigenous Resources Network. With more than 20 years of experience in Indigenous, Arctic, and resource development and governance, she's widely recognized as a leading authority on many of the most significant issues shaping Canada's resource and northern policy landscape. Her extensive body of work spans Indigenous economic development, resource politics and policy, energy security, Arctic human security, regional Arctic governance and the Arctic Council, Arctic innovation, and First Nations equity and own source revenues. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Calgary in 2011. Dr. Exner-Pirot also serves on the boards of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network and the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. She's a member of the Canadian Defence and Security Network and the network coordinator for the North American Arctic Defence and Security Network. In addition, she's the managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook. Over her career, she's published more than 45 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and edited volumes, and has presented at over 100 conferences and events across Canada and internationally. She's also a prolific contributor of op-eds to Canada's leading publications. So please join me in welcoming today's keynote speaker, Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, as she shares her insights from Yukon's core to Canada's future, critical minerals and Arctic nation building.
Well, what a kind introduction. I think my mom must have wrote that. Here we go. So delighted to be back here again. Actually, I've been in Whitehorse, I think, 3 times in the last year or so. So I'm trying to find out what are the good coffee spots and the good place to eat. But very excited to be here in particular for this conference. Obviously, critical minerals has been on lots of people's minds. It's usually on my mind and usually on your mind, but other people are starting to think about it too. So I wanted to do with my half hour is just kind of talk about the politics of critical minerals, how it became a driver, why the Yukon has the opportunity for such a moment, why people in Ottawa or Beijing or Washington, D.C. or Brussels might be thinking about this, and then kind of what it means for policy in the end for the Yukon. So kind of a 30,000-foot view. I'm not going to come here and tell you guys how to mine in the Yukon, but I might try to tell you how other people are thinking about mining in the Yukon. So you guys are part of a boom and bust sector. Also is the same for Arctic studies, very much a boom and bust sector. And it tends to follow the same cycle, actually, that the Arctic gets hot when the commodity cycle gets hot, and we're seeing that now. But it is a perennial feature in Canadian history to think of the Arctic as always this untapped vast potential that we can exploit, and for 10 years we do things to do it, and then the commodity cycle busts, and for 10 years we stop thinking about the Arctic, and therefore it repeats again and again. This particular little newspaper clipping is from the 1950s in the Diefenbaker days, and if you recall, there was a Road to Resources Northern Nation Building Plan at that time as well. You even have the Athabasca tar sands on there, and a few of the ports that may even look familiar today. Churchill, obviously, and a few others. All of which to say is a lot of the discussion on the Arctic and on its vast potential for resources is certainly a theme that we've heard and seen in Canada before. So I'm just going to go through some of the major drivers as I see them, both from the geopolitical side, the national side, and then the regional or territorial side. So what is driving international interest in the Arctic in 2025? I think, probably Trump's expansionist, is a nice way to put it, expansionist rhetoric about Greenland and Canada, about wanting to annex Canada, make it to the 51st state, of wanting to take over Greenland, make it one of their territories, and the connection that has with critical minerals, and in particular in the case of Greenland with rare earth elements, which probably in this room we know aren't that rare, but are obviously important geopolitically right now. And that has highlighted for people, and has certainly been conveyed by the Trump administration, that there is some vulnerability we should be concerned about, that Denmark and maybe Canada aren't pulling their weight in the region, that the United States has an imperative to step in, and if they don't, that China and Russia will kind of take over everything. So that's driven some of the international attention. We also see for the first time this year hot conflict in the Arctic. And if you didn't know, the Arctic, while it's had a long Cold War and was the center in many ways of the Cold War, hasn't had conflict or kinetic kind of war fighting since World War II, when Russia and Finland fought their war. But we see for the first time that it has come back to the Arctic in the form of Ukraine drone attacks in the Kola Peninsula, which is kind of on the portion of Russia that borders Norway, and is where a lot of the Russian nuclear naval fleet is located. So something new, where we could talk about the Arctic as a zone of peace, but obviously geopolitics are finding its way from the south into the north. The reason why the Americans in particular care about the Canadian Arctic and about NORAD, so NATO follows North Atlantic. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, very concerned with Russia coming in to the North Atlantic. NORAD follows North American Aerospace and Maritime Defense, and it's a bilateral arrangement between Canada and the United States to jointly defend the continent. And why the Americans feel as though Canada has not been pulling its weight, doesn't have its socks pulled up, is because they feel increasing threats of Chinese and Russian hypersonic missiles, that it is still a very close approach or convenient approach for missiles from China and Russia to come over and hit the United States, and that with our current North Warning System, we are not able to detect and therefore deter or intercept in time these kinds of new weapon systems. And so very much focus on NORAD modernization. If you hear about that, and the $38 billion that's been dedicated to it is really meant, first of all, to be able to detect any of these new weapon systems, and therefore to deter that the Russians or Chinese might throw them in the first place. We also, of course, have an assumption that the Arctic is becoming more accessible with climate change. And that is usually the first paragraph in any story you will read in international news media about the Arctic, that as climate change happens and sea ice melts, it's opening up. There's a scramble, there's a race, it's becoming easy, is what it's assumed, to access all those resources that have been covered with ice until now. And I guess you guys in this room will know that it's still not very easy, and I'll talk about that a little bit, but that certainly is the assumption that drives interest. And last but not least for this crowd, concern about the security of global supplies of energy and critical minerals is absolutely what drives interest in the Arctic usually, and in particular this time. That originally we had a sense that we needed more battery minerals, that we were having an energy transition, and the bottleneck was going to be minerals as we tried to get off fossil fuels. And now the concern has moved more of late to a sense that China dominates a lot of the supply chain, Russia dominates parts of it, adversaries dominate parts of it, and that makes us very vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. So that's the international aspect. What is driving it in Canada? And to what I point before, a lot of the renewed attention on the Arctic in Canada is based on defense and security. Very prevalent theme in Canada, you can't get rid of it for the last few decades, that a sense that our Arctic sovereignty is always threatened and that we are never doing enough to protect our Arctic sovereignty. And that is such a basic assumption in the average Canadian's mind, who may know nothing else about the Arctic, but a sense that it's at risk and we aren't doing enough. And that we need to have this NORAD modernization, and that if we're going to now commit to spending 3.5% of our GDP on military things, that a lot of that is going to take place in the Arctic. That's probably where we should be directing it. And then, of course, the more recent drivers in the last year of the Trump administration coming in and applying tariffs, and in general being a bit more provocative with Canada, and the desire to trade with other countries, to diversify away from the United States, and that related to this is a real focus on building nation-building infrastructure, east, west, and north, anywhere but south if we can avoid it. And that's where the north, again, becomes one of those three places that we can move away from the south. And then finally, still tensions with Russia and China, which if you're in the military are definitely our main geopolitical adversaries, and they have been cooperating a lot closer in the Arctic in the past 5 years. Part of the, the isolation of Russia post-Ukraine has moved Russia and China closer together, and that's a pretty fierce combination. And we would like to not be vulnerable to whatever, things against the rule of law, things that don't fall under the world liberal order that they may be planning, that Russia has already been doing. And finally, what's driving this interest at a regional level, and I would say at a territorial level? This could be number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, perennial infrastructure and affordability issues. That the north of Canada is always underdeveloped from an infrastructure perspective, and any hook that politicians can get to advocate for more money and more spending and more building of infrastructure will be used. But you also have some real economic pressures of interest for this group. You'll all be aware is the sunsetting of the Northwest Territories diamond industry, which was about 25% of their GDP. And the first mine, Rio Tinto's Diavik, will be closed, as I understand, in the next quarter, and down to just one producing mine in the Yukon. And as a result, partly of this and partly of some other factors, a much worsening private to public sector spending ratio. That public spending and public hiring is becoming a bigger and bigger part of northern economies, and private sector spending and private sector hiring is becoming a smaller part. And this is financially unsustainable. Now, part of the good news, or why we feel bullish, is that Ottawa has found a newfound love for critical minerals in the last 3 years. And again, in general, since COVID, mining has seen a sea change in public opinion, moving from a villain, bad extractive resources, to in many ways a hero, the thing that we need to have an energy transition, the thing that Canada has that the rest of the world wants, the thing that we can use as leverage against the United States or as leverage towards new alliances, the thing that we can be important for in NATO, the thing that can change our economy from a laggard to a leader. And so since 2023 in particular, the federal government has advanced several critical minerals policies that is probably bullish or helpful for you in the room. The first was the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy in 2023, and that was the $3.8 billion investment, and really the first time where it was a real shift in the government's approach, even under Trudeau, towards accepting and wanting minerals. And just in the last 6 weeks, I would say, very good movement for your sector. The G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance, and of course, Canada was the president or the chair of the G7 this year. A great time for us to be chair. And what do our G7 allies want from us right now? Of course, energy and critical minerals. Still a little bit hard to talk about energy, and so a lot of the political eggs were put in the basket of critical minerals with our G7 allies. And so announced, I think they said 26 projects and quite a bit of money, and said that we would use our own Defense Production Act to stockpile minerals. And then in budget 2025, which I'm certain that I think, the Mining Association of Canada wrote a pretty good chunk of it. They have no complaints about what was put in there. We get a $2 billion critical mineral sovereign fund, first and last mile fund, the extension of the mineral exploration tax credit, and an expansion of the critical mineral exploration tax credit, more minerals that can be used under that regime. So Ottawa and, of course, the Major Projects Office, but really actually doing things, I think, in a concrete way should change the narrative on Canadian mining. And as I mentioned, whereas in 2020, even 2023, I would say a lot of the focus on critical minerals, why we started talking about critical, was about the energy transition, certainly from the perspective of Ottawa and the federal Liberals. But in the last 2 years, that conversation has evolved really from battery metals and the Ring of Fire, for example, or nickel or lithium, towards defense materials. And this was kind of punctuated last December when NATO put out its list of defense critical raw materials. You can see some of your favorites. There's tungsten, platinum, a few other things that you guys might have, but that these are generally not strong markets, not good global markets, but they're the ones that if you were to have a hot conflict with Russia, more than we have in Ukraine, or even to sustain the Ukraine war, if you were to have a conflict with China over the South China Sea, these are vulnerable ones that if we needed to expand our defense industrial base very quickly, we need to have a better, supplies of these and more within our own Western kind of sphere of influence, not things that we need to depend on other countries, and in particular China. And of course, we've seen China willing to weaponize its monopoly of some critical minerals to a greater extent in the last year than we had been seeing. One reason why people care about rare earth elements so much is because in 2010, China, which had developed a monopoly, especially with the processing of it, restricted its export, for example, to Japan. And that was the first time in 2010 where you start to see, China is willing to weaponize, it can weaponize, a lot of our economy depends on these things. We need to have some buffers, we need to have some redundancy in supply. Japan actually moved in quite a far direction to get some of that redundancy, but the rest of the Western world just kind of looked and highlighted that it was a problem, but didn't really start doing anything about it in a really serious way until the last 2 years, and really in the last year. And that was in part because with Trump's tariffs on China, there's been a lot of retaliation by China, putting certain export restrictions on a lot of what it will call advantage materials. And so it has put export restrictions on tungsten, antimony, bismuth, rare earths, gallium, germanium, and I don't know if it's put on export restrictions on the other ones, but you could assume that those would be next on the list of things that would put an export restriction on. The reason it's an advantage mineral for China is that it can weaponize, or it can manipulate, or it can control the global market for those ones. The ones that it considers a shortage are ones that it'll want to tie up a vertical supply chain through partnerships with other countries, for example, through the Belt and Road Initiative. And as a result of all this, in the last 2.5 years, we've seen the United States Department of Defense put some money into 7 Canadian critical minerals projects. 2 of them were in the territories. One that you guys would all be familiar with, the DPA award in December 2024, I believe, to Fireweed's Mactung Tungsten project. They got $15.8 million from the Department of Defense and $12.9 from Canada. And just on the other side of the border, a bismuth mine through Fortune's NICO project, a little bit less money, $6.4 million US through the DPA, and $5.6 million from NRCan. And which is the kind of thing that Canada says now that we will start to do on our own. We were matching American defense DPA project investments with Natural Resources Canada critical minerals investments. That means they didn't count towards our NATO goal of 3.5%. And now if we filter them and structure them through Department of Defense spending, we could probably move a little bit faster, and we'll be able to count towards our NATO spend. And then I'll just, so those are part of the drivers. The other driver is the expectation that we are in an underinvestment stage of the cycle, and at some point, and I missed Pierre Lassonde's speech, but I'm assuming he spoke to this, at some point the cycle has to pick up and we have to start spending more on mining. We can't live off the excesses of 2012 for too much longer. And so you see that globally, we've added 1 billion people since 2013, but we're still only spending about 2/3 in real dollars in mining. And that doesn't account for inflation, this particular chart. So we've probably overspent. Obviously, we overspent at the peak of the cycle last time, but we are underspending today, and at some point, the piper will have to be paid. So what does this have to do with the Yukon? How can Yukon fill the gap or capitalize on the mood shift or leverage the funding or the opportunities available to it? This is what Natural Resources Canada thinks you guys have going on. This is what's in the major projects inventory, which is to say these are projects at a sufficient phase of progress that they've been kind of calculated or inserted into whatever the inventory needs as a baseline. And so casino is the big circle, and I'm assuming it didn't list it, that it's Coffee, Kuzikaya, Minto, or Selkirk, and that the blue triangle down there is the Atlow Hydro expansion. So these are what the Government of Canada thinks you have as potential major projects or sufficiently advanced. These are the mineral exploration projects, the top 100 exploration projects in 2024. Just about half in Canada are gold, which you might not be surprised. As I understand, the last 6 mines that were opened in Canada were for gold mines, and at $4,000 US an ounce. We all know why that is, but some of the other commodities are going to have to follow. And so when I look at the clusters here, I see a lot of uranium exploration in Saskatchewan. I see a lot of gold exploration in the Abitibi, some in Western Ontario, and then of course the Golden Triangle in Yukon is the other kind of hot spot, and that's mostly gold and copper and a little bit of zinc. I just had to look at the sign, Yukon Geoscience. Yeah, there it is, gold, silver, copper, zinc. That's what we're mostly exploring for, or that's what the government considers a top mineral exploration project. And so the question is, how do you capitalize from this exploration into some real producing mines, producing taxes and royalties? And it is still a little bit of an uphill battle. And again, I don't invest. I have no economic advice, but from a policy perspective, Yukon still doesn't look particularly attractive. And so the Fraser Institute, another think tank based in Canada, has done this for a long time, an annual survey of mining executives to gauge of all the jurisdictions, mining significant jurisdictions in the world, which ones are kind of doing better, which ones are doing worse, what are people looking at. Saskatchewan is usually the top jurisdiction in Canada, and you can see it does pretty well there. I think Nevada, Alaska, Western Australia will usually also make the top 5, Lapland and Finland. But from a policy perspective, Yukon does better than the other territories, but it still does not do well. So it's right in the middle for policy attractiveness. It's 24th out of 82 for overall investment attractiveness, which is better, but not great. And look at your mineral potential. Top 10 jurisdiction, 8th jurisdiction in the world for mineral potential. So the gap here is that your geological potential is a lot better than your policy attractiveness for mining executives who maybe don't think about you very much, but who might think about you more if you looked a bit more attractive. And this gets reflected in the kind of money that gets spent. So this is, again, the major projects inventory, even though the Canadian Arctic, which for this particular graph is the 3 territories, comprises about 40% of Canada. It does not comprise 40% of resource investment. And there's obvious reasons for that, the population and the demand and the infrastructure, but there's tons of potential, so much more investment that could be being attracted to the territories if you got the policy and the infrastructure side right. But fundamentally, and again, this will be no surprise to you guys, but to a lot of crowds that I speak of and to a lot of layman crowds, they think climate change is the thing that's driving or not driving Arctic investment. And of course, the thing that really drives Arctic investment is the price of the commodity, which is why you're seeing some growth in gold in the north these days, and why you're seeing diamonds, falling by the wayside. But the Arctic is a very expensive jurisdiction to operate in. Usually, as a rule of thumb, a base metal mine is going to be 2.5 times more expensive in the territories than in the provinces. And we all know why that is, the lack of energy and transportation infrastructure, having to depend on a fly-in labor force. My husband is one, he works at Gatcho Quay, which tends to be more expensive. Distance from market, so you have higher transportation costs. Harsh conditions, which just means things break or it's harder to get to, and high environmental standards as well as social standards. And for me, looking at this from kind of a geopolitical, macroeconomic perspective. The last time the Arctic was hot, especially in 2008 when Russia went and put a titanium flag on the Arctic, or Stephen Harper said use it or lose it, was the height of the last commodity cycle. And so what I think will happen, and we can see it, is that as there will become more and more interest in the Yukon and in the Canadian Arctic as those commodity prices continue to climb. And I think we probably have a few more years of those prices climbing and plateauing. So how does this all get translated into federal policy? And of course, in recent months with the new Carney government, they've hung a lot of their kind of major projects, build, baby, build, onto these projects of national interest, which was under C5, the Building Canada Act, and then the development of the Major Projects Office. The three that have been named by the Major Projects Office that have already been referred is the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor, which to me is really the Northwest Transmission Line, and the Yukon BC Grid Connect. I think that conservation, corridor must have come about 3 days ago. No one had ever heard of that before. But anyways, conservation area the size of Greece is how it was described in the PMO's news release. The Port of Churchill upgrades and corridor, and a little bit more money was actually sprinkled into that last night, right during the Grey Cup. I guess Winnipeg Blue Bombers weren't watching the Saskatchewan Roughriders win, so they could make some Port of Churchill announcements. And also, obviously, the hydroelectric project for Iqaluit. And the other ones that have been floated, either by the Prime Minister himself or certainly by the premiers trying to position them, is the Arctic Security Corridor in Northwest Territories and Nunavut. I won't try to mention the Kikak-Tarjuak deep sea port, Kivalliq Hydro Fiber Link, the Tulsan Hydro Expansion, and the Mackenzie Valley Highway. Northwest Territories hasn't been added to the list yet, so if I were a betting person, I would say in the next 3 to 6 months, Northwest Territories is going to get something, and which means that Yukon probably won't get another one for a little while, if they do get another one. That means your eggs are in the Yukon BC Grid Connect. That's your best chance, I would say, for getting some big federal money. So here it is. What is this BC Yukon Grid Connect? And I don't have to tell you, lots of you in the room, it has been discussed for over 10 years and was initially shelved, I think, around 2014, 2015, probably the end of the last commodity cycle, when maybe it didn't seem so urgent, but also the price tag was just so high that attention was moved to smaller projects. But it's gained more, again, with the narrative, the critical minerals, the Arctic, the geopolitical drivers gained more attention the last 2 years. So that last September, it got $40 million for feasibility study. In May, BC and the Yukon government signed an MOU. And of course, this week it was listed, referred to the Major Projects Office for further review. And it would obviously be very good for the Golden Triangle and for Yukon mining. But the real problem isn't the the transmission is a problem. Something has to put electrons into that transmission line. So while we may have a transmission line, someone's got to solve the problem of generation. And I would suggest to you that may be the nearest, lowest hanging economic development fruit for Yukon, is to provide generation to feed into BC and into the Golden Triangle. As it stands, BC imported 25% of its electricity last year. Drought is killing it. It just introduced legislation last month basically saying no electricity for Bitcoin mining. We're going to restrict for artificial intelligence. They're running out of electricity, and I don't think a transmission line is going to have electrons to get all the way to the casino mine unless some huge other Site C gets put in the book somewhere, which it isn't now, and it took 20 years the last time. And finally, with my last few minutes, I just want to address climate change, which is much less of the shipping issue or the climate change issue is less of a Yukon story, because most of you are shipping, as we discussed, would go out of the Skagway. But the idea that climate change is driving this, it probably won't, at least for the next 20 years. One reason why we all thought, and Al Gore said, the Arctic might be ice-free, I think he might have said by 2025, some people said by 2030, was because there was this time between 1980 and 2010, and especially if you're in 2012, that was the record low sea ice extent ever. And it was extremely dramatic. And if you're just looking at between 1998 and 2012, you would think that the ice will be gone by 2030 if it had continued on that trajectory. What happened was, it was the old sea ice that did melt, and it did, and the ice has changed for sure. But the annual new sea ice that comes every winter, that's starting to grow now, still comes back every winter, because if you look outside, it's still dark, and it will be dark for 3 months in the Arctic, and the ice will come back every year, and it takes a long time for all that ice that grows for 6 months to melt. And so you are seeing a leveling off of the summer sea ice, and so it is pretty much, if you started, 2010 or 2012 as a baseline, it's still declining a very little bit, but it's almost plateaued. And so trajectories of when the Arctic might become ice-free, and for this, I'm talking about resource development, when it might become cheaper for resource development as a new way to get product to markets, won't be for a couple of decades. And we also see that the Arctic shipping season is actually shrinking, that all that young sea ice is more brittle, it's bergier, it's more difficult to navigate, it's less predictable. The old sea ice used to hold it up as a wall, and you could move around it or be safer around it. This new kind of sea ice is actually not making shipping easier, it's making shipping harder. And not just on the Canadian side, although it is making shipping harder on the Canadian side. And that was this year, we had a 70-day season with 17 full transits, but also on the Russian side. It is way easier to ship through the Northern Sea route than through the Northwest Passage, way easier, but it's still not easy, and they still don't have a year-round shipping season, even with their icebreakers. So just to, I've given you a lot of information. This is my last slide. What are kind of the points that I wanted to highlight that I hope you think about, or I think you remember, or what was that all information, what was about? What's the so what? One is that interest in the Arctic waxes and wanes with the commodity cycle. And right now the cycle is waxing, and therefore so is interest in the Arctic. But this time around, the geopolitical dynamic is different, more prevalent. Last time around, the cycle moved and waxed and waned along with Chinese economic growth. And that was a time where China was growing by 8 to 10%. They had a demographic dividend as a result of a one-child policy, and they just had so much demand, there was nothing restricting their demand. This time around, it is much more about separating back into Western and Eastern blocks and wanting to have independence in the supply chains on the Western side. Copper, gold, silver, and defense minerals are hot, and that happens to be quite a bit of what the Yukon has, which is great. Copper in particular will be hotter because of electrification, and whether it's for EVs and heat pumps or whether it's for data centers and air conditioning, it'll be some combination of both. It won't depend on the energy transition. You will see increasing demand for electricity, for transmission, for distribution, kind of regardless of the pace of the energy transition. The Yukon BC grid to me is a real possibility, but the question mark, if I were Yukon and I wanted to attract a couple $100 million or $1 billion in Ottawa dollars, would be to figure out the generation, provide a solution to that generation, and that includes linking to the Golden Triangle. Yukon itself needs to do more on the policy side. I don't know if it's acceptable to ask for Ottawa taxpayer dollars when you have so much more work you could do on the Yukon side to make it easier for things to get built. And there's only so much you can do with federal taxpayer dollars to paper over your fiscal situation. Some of it will have to be solved here. And finally, Arctic nation building as a whole is extremely expensive. After 100 years of history, you can be sure it will be incremental, that there won't be $5 billion projects in the Arctic with 110,000 voters, that there may be one or two, and you might want to make sure that you're one of those one or two, and therefore, the faster that you can get a business case and First Nations support and supporting mines and a private partnership on a Yukon BC Grid Connect, the more your chances will be that you'll be one of those incremental nation building projects that gets built in this cycle. And finally, I didn't talk about it too much, but there isn't, we talk about that we need this for defense and security. The security threats aren't particularly about an invasion of the Arctic or about Russia or China stealing our resources. They're mostly about hypersonic missiles that will go over top of you. And so a lot of the money and the infrastructure for NORAD modernization or defense is going to come into the Yukon, and therefore I think your best kind of nation building hook to convince the rest of the Canada to put some money into this territory is on the critical mineral side. And that's my TED Talk for today. Thanks, everybody.